Hello kids, it's the trailer reader here with another episode of your 10-minute literary review. Today we'll be examining Persepolis, an autobiographical graphic novel by Marjane Satrapi. Now I know what you're thinking. An autobiography? That's a graphic novel? Huh? Well, let me ease your confusion up a bit and give you 3 reasons why this is a good thing. Number 1. The graphic novel form of storytelling is a very compelling story format. In fact, it's gained wide acceptance among many literary critics of the literary genre, which is why they now appear in your required reading list. Number 2. This story has thematic elements that plays on multiple levels, which makes it much more appealing to a wider audience. From the middle school student to the high school student, even adults enjoy this novel. In fact, it's my wife's current favorite novel. And this is one of the reasons why the International Baccalaureate program recommends it for its reading list for the senior students, not just middle school kids. And number 3, it's cool. I mean, let's face it, if I grew up in a war-torn country from my childhood, I would want my life to be a graphic novel. As it is, I grew up in a boring middle-class suburban neighborhood. So my graphic novel would look something like this. Okay, son, so in the second panel, Daddy is beating The Legend of Zelda for the 6th time that summer. Hey, where are you going? Come back. Okay, so before we get into the novel in depth, let's cover some of the basics that you need to know. Now, I've already mentioned that the novel is written by Marjane Satrapi, and it's her story. But you also need to know that it was originally written in the French language in 4 separate publications. Now, by the time it got translated into English, it was reduced to 2 parts. And the first part of the book covers the child Marji as she grows up in Iran amid civil strife, an oppressive regime, and even a war with Iraq. Now, that part of the novel ends when Marji is a young teenager and she, for her own safety, is forced to leave Iran and her family to go to Europe for a better education and a better hope for life. Now, part 2 of the novel covers a much older Marji, a young adult version of Marji, as she struggles with tragic romances and even being accused of stealing from her landlady. In depression and thoughts of suicide, she moves back to her family in Iran, where she meets a young man, falls in love with him, sort of, and they marry, and then they get divorced. And at the end of it, she decides once more to leave her family, only this in Iran, but only this time for Paris, where she resides for the rest of her life, as far as I know. Now, both parts of the book were made into a cartoon movie years later, and you can find it online, watch it for free if you want to do that. But it's usually part 1 of the book that is covered in classrooms, and that's what we'll be covering here today. Now, Satrapi wrote this book for the Western world in order for them to have a better understanding of her beloved Iranian people, especially over concerns of global terrorism and misconceptions about her home culture. Ironically enough, many parents and communities of the Western world have concerns over this book. Why? Because it's so violent. It has many dark themes present in what's considered a children's book, essentially. Interestingly enough, the people of Iran aren't able to read this book because the government of Iran has banned it. That's right. This book is banned, which kind of makes you want to read it all the more, huh? Huh? Yeah, I know. I've seen you guys watch those banned commercials on YouTube. I've seen you click it. Don't bother denying it. So, now that we got all that out of the way, let's talk about the novel in more depth. Now, part 1 of Persepolis begins with a chapter on how the newly installed Iranian government forces all the girls and women to wear the veil. Now, this sometimes has comic and even tragic effects. One particular moment that's really funny is when the girls are like, "What's this veil? Why am I wearing it?" And they're playing with their play yard, and someone's saying, "Ooh, I'm the monster of darkness. Look at my veil." And the other one's saying, "Execution in the name of freedom," which is something they picked up by the adults in their lives. So it's comic. It's a little bit tragic. It actually can get a lot worse. Many women who protest the use of the veil are beaten violently and some are killed. And even Marji's mom, who doesn't wear the veil properly, is threatened with rape and murder. This is a very serious thing, and this is in the kid's book. But this is how the whole thing begins. Throughout the autobiography, there are flashbacks to earlier times, which gives the reader insight into how this oppressive regime came into power after protests against the Shah's regime, the earlier regime, turned violent and bloody and led to civil war. It also gives us insight into Marji's family, their descent from royalty and into the middle-class modern family that they are now. Now, the rest of the novel tracks the increasingly violent government and the effects it has on Marji's family, the people of Iran, and especially Marji herself. And it also talks about how Iran uses its war with Iraq to maintain its power and control over the people. Now, because Marji has been brought up to be independently minded and has had a liberal European education, she often comes into conflict with her teachers and even the local authorities of Iran. And we watch her struggle as she loses friends and family with death all around her, and very soon, by the end of the book, it becomes very obvious she's no longer safe in Iran. And so her family makes the very painful decision of sending her away by herself to live with friends in Vienna to get a better education and to be safe. It's a tearjerker, actually. I cry up every single time. It's just... I can't believe it. I don't have a tissue. Okay, there are many themes present throughout the novel Persepolis, but the three biggest ones are, number one, how governments, even Western governments, can be corrupt and exploit the people. Number two, how important family is. Even though you're a teenage girl and struggling to find your own identity, they're still the most important thing you have. And number three, the actions of governments, even bad governments, are not representative of the entire people. In fact, Satrapi's love of the Iranian people really comes out through this novel, which is what she intended in the first place. Now, it's time to analyze this book a little more in depth. So let's begin, shall we? Now, perspective is critical to understanding this novel. It's key. And from Marji, we get a childlike view of the horrific things that happened to her. And because it's a childlike view, it's sometimes confused. Many times it's comic, and oftentimes it's understated in its horribleness. The first example of this is when Marji's dad's brothers get released from prison and they come and visit the family. They've been political prisoners and they've seen all kinds of terrible things. People being tortured. They themselves were tortured. People being dismembered. And there's a little girl Marji listening in on the conversation. And you can see from the images that she doesn't have a very clear picture of what that means. Because you see these little bodies like chopped up into neat, even little sections, no blood or gore or anything like that. And this is part of what makes the novel tolerable for a younger age, because again, they're not really getting the full picture like adults would. The second example is when Marji and a group of friends decide to enact in play what they hear the adults talking about, and decide to go round up other kids in the neighborhood to torture them as political prisoners. And while it's sort of a comic effect as you're reading it, much later you realize, wait, this is not so great. And even Marji herself feels terrible and evil and unclean about it. But you can see that this is, again, from a child's perspective on how things happen. The third example is probably one of the more tragic ones in the book, and it talks about how Marji discovers about this young woman who has been hiding because her family has been killed by the government, and the government finds her. Now, the thing is that the government has a law that says you cannot execute virgins, that it's against the law. So how do they get around this? Well, they force her to marry one of the soldiers, and then the soldier rapes her, and then next day they execute her because she's no longer a virgin, and then they send the family the bullet that killed her as a warning to the family. How do you even deal with this as a kid? How do you even make sense of this kind of thing? But this is the kind of thing that happens in the novel, but she does it in a way, Marjane Satrapi does this in such a way that the adults realize the full implications of everything, but the kids are going like, gee, that's kind of bad. And so, therefore, in middle school, you're able to read things like this. If it were graphically described, any of these things, the book would not be allowed. But because it's done in such a childlike way, we're able to discuss it a little more freely. Now, because this is a memoir, it has a scattered events throughout many years of Marji's life. And so to really get a feel of the story of the book, you have to track the inner conflict. And there are three inner conflicts primary to this book that you need to be aware of. The first one is independence versus conformity. Again, Marji is a very independent young woman, but there are many forces at work to make her conform to expectations. And one of the first ones, and slightly more comical but also heartfelt, is her struggle of independence from her mom. There's one really memorable scene where she goes down to the basement, sneaks down there away from her mom after a fight. She takes a cigarette and says, "With this cigarette, I leave behind my childhood." However, with society, it's a lot tougher. She ends up slapping her principal at one point, which is a complete shocker. That's not something that's ever done, and her very life is in danger. So again, who am I as a person? Do I struggle with conformity on the inside and just like, okay, I'll do it, or do I be my own person but risk death? The second theme that runs throughout this novel is secularism versus religion. Now, Marji's parents are secular Marxists, and they brought her up to be an independent secular person. But from a very young age, Marji has a love of God and love of her religion, and even wants to be a prophet of Allah. And in fact, the best prophet ever, because all the other prophets were male, and her grandmother thinks she's just absolutely charming with this thing. But there's a real struggle as real life events shake her up and challenge her faith in God to continue believing, especially in the light of her education and what's happening around her. And the most critical moment is when her beloved uncle Anoosh is sent back to prison and is executed. And this presents a real challenge for her faith. The third inner conflict in this novel has to do with Marji being a member of an upper class when everyone else is lower class. There's a huge conflict in social differences throughout the novel. Even their own maid won't be able to get married to the boy next door because she's a maid. The boy next door thought she was one of the daughters, like, "Oh, I'm interested in you." But he said, "No, she's just a maid. Oh, I'm not interested in you." And the parents, who were theoretically against this kind of thing, said, "Yeah, that's just the way it is." Now, there is external conflict in this book. There's lots of external conflict. The only thing is it's mostly environmental. There's nothing really Marji can do about the war or the oppressive regime or the bombs that are exploding and killing friends. She just has to survive it. And so as a plot mover, it's okay, but as a real story builder, it's not really the ones we focus on. The third, and probably one of the most important things you need to look at as far as analysis goes, are the drawings and the illustrations themselves. Marjane Satrapi paints a really big picture with her drawings. They're very simplistic and childlike, but you got to pay attention to how they're drawn. The fact that they're only in black and white, there's no gray, there's no color. What is black and what is white? What kind of symbols are in there? And the simplicity of the drawings themselves and where they're located to one another, they all tell a vivid story about the author's message. And so you have to take the time to pay attention to it. Don't just gloss over it. Look at them and ask yourself, why did the author put this here? Now, there's one good, brilliant example of something called juxtaposition, where two scenes are overlapping each other in the chapter called The Key. And the chapter above, the scene above, you see a group of kids wearing little plastic keys because they're going to go to heaven if they die as martyrs, are leaping through the air through an explosion and being torn to pieces. And just below that are Marji's friends in a secret hidden party, and they're jumping up in the air because they're dancing with joy in their punk music from the 80s. So the juxtaposition of this draws a sharp contrast between the rich and the poor and how people are treated in this country at that time. So all this brought together makes for very compelling reading, and I hope you use these in your analysis. Now let's get back to something that's really important, and I like to end the video with this, is important tips on how to read this book. Okay, tip number one, and this is just a reminder from the previous section, pay attention to the drawings and illustrations. I mean it. Don't just gloss over them. Look at them and ask yourself, why did the author put this here? Why did she draw it in this way? Because she's telling a very specific story at a very specific point. Number two, track the inner conflict. This is a memoir written over several years, and it goes from forward in time to backward in time, and you've got to make sure that you understand what's happening. And tracking the inner conflict, what's going on with Marji's, what she struggles with, is going to bring out a fuller understanding of the story. Number three, read the author's introduction. In there, Marjane Satrapi herself writes a lot about why she wrote this novel and gives you a little deeper insight into what's going on and what she's hoping for from the reader. This will also add to your understanding of the book. Number four, make a timeline. This story jumps around a lot in time periods, so make sure you do some historical research on the times that they talk about, especially starting from the Shah's regime that happens just previous to the story, all the way to the time of Iran's war with Iraq. This will help you figure out what's going on when Marji's talking about these things and give you a better understanding of it and not get lost in the flow. Well, that's it. Thanks, kids. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful in analyzing Persepolis. Listed below are a bunch of links to help you further your understanding of this novel should you require it. And as always, if you have any specific questions about the book or would like to suggest another book for me to cover in future episodes, please leave it in the comments section below. Now, before we go, I have a very important question for all you students out there and all you adults who may or may not have grown out of geekdom. And the question is this: are graphic novels a form of literature? Yes or no? Let the debate begin. Okay, guys, please don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. This is the Trailer Reader, signing out. Hey, babe, do you think because of COVID-19, the women of Iran wear masks, like, under their veils?
Why? Do you mean they should wear masks outside their veils?
No, that's not what I meant.